So the question asks me to write this as a decimal. I'm first going to write it as a fraction. And so I'm going to solve this in two different ways. I'm going to solve this where I think through the answer, and then I'm going to solve it on the other side where I use procedural method. So for this one, I know this is a percentage, so that means my denominator is 100. If I wrote this the way that I read it, I would read this 662 hundredths. That means that my number needs to end in the hundredths place. If I put my decimal here, my number would end in the tenths place because it's only one digit behind the decimal. But if I put my decimal here, my answer would end in the tenths, hundredths place. So that means that this would be my answer as a decimal. If I did it in a procedural way, we know that when we talk about whole numbers, there's an imaginary decimal that appears behind the number. If you're not quite sure, think about it like money, and that imaginary decimal will appear. If I'm turning it into a decimal and it's a percent, I need to move my decimal to the left two places, because when I take 662 and divide it by 100, that's actually what I'm doing. So then I end up with 6 and 62 hundredths. So both ways are possible, and if you notice, no matter what way I use, I get the same answer. So my hint to you all, or my tip to you all, was to write 5 8/10 as a fraction, and you write it the same way that you read it. So the 8 is in the tenths place, so then I would write it as 5 8/10. Now I need to take this and turn this into a percentage. So it needs to turn into a fraction that has a denominator of 100. There's two different ways that I can do this. I can do this one by separating this out, right? And to say that 5 hundredths is really 500. And then to think about this 8/10 in terms of how to write it with a denominator of 100. So if it's out of 100 and I have 5 whole hundredths, then that's how I got my 500. And now I'm thinking about 8/10, but I need to write it with a denominator of 10. That's easy. I'm going to multiply both by 10. And when I do that, I get 100 in my denominator and 80 in my numerator. So what I really have is 5 hundredths plus 80 hundredths, which is really 580%. I'm going to show you another way for me to get this question, to do this problem. And that's for me to take this fraction, but to write it as an improper fraction. So that means I will multiply 5 times 10 and then add the 8, and I got 58 over 10. I still need to convert this into a fraction with a denominator of 100. So I'm going to multiply my numerator and my denominator by 10, and I get 580 over 100, which is just 580%. So either way, these are not the only two ways to get to the answer, but either way, I got 580. I got the exact same percentage. I used the same thought process of working with my fraction to get a denominator of 100, and that was what I got. Decomposing these questions, right? So what is usually as asking me what I want it to equal? So this part is really asking me what the answer is. And 30% of 90. Whenever I see of in math, most of the time, not all the time, of means to multiply. Most of the time, not all of the time. So if I'm taking 30% of 90, I can't work with this percentage as a percent. I need to turn it into either a decimal or a fraction. It's easier to work with the decimal than it is to work with a fraction to me. So I'm going to turn it into a decimal, but I could also turn it into a fraction and get the same answer. So I'm really taking 30% of 90. That's what this question is asking me to do. So now that I know this, I can multiply it out. You can either use a calculator or you can multiply it this way. If I'm multiplying it by hand, this number has 0 digits behind the decimal because there's no decimal there. This number has 1, 2 digits to the right of the decimal, so I'm going to write that. That means that my answer should have, I'm adding these together, should have 2 numbers to the right of the decimal. So 0 times everything is just 0. 3 times 0 is 0. 9 times 3 is 27. I need to have 2 digits behind my decimal, so I'm going to put my decimal in the place where I have 2 digits behind my decimal. So what is 30% of 90? My answer here is 27. So let me recap really quickly what I did. I looked at the wording of the problem to figure out what information was given. I knew that I was looking for the answer of this word problem because the what is was there. And I equated that to an equal sign. So then I converted my percent to either a fraction or a decimal. I like using decimals because I like working with decimals better than working with fractions, but I could do both. And then I'm going to multiply because I see this word of. Of most of the time, like 85% of the time, when you see of, it means to multiply, not 100%, but just 85% of the time. And then I'm multiplying it times 90. So, all right, so I wrote out the question, and I'm gonna box in this keyword, what is, and also of. What is usually means that there's an equal sign. Of usually means that I need to multiply. I wanna know what is 145% of 60. For this one, I'm going to work with a fraction just to show you that if you work with a fraction, you get the same answer. If you did the problem and you converted it to a decimal, if you converted it to a decimal, it would be 1.45 times 60. If you wrote it as a fraction, it would be 1 45 hundredths times 60. Both of these are appropriate to do. I'm going to use an unorthodox method for calculating 1 45 hundredths times 60 using my fraction. I'm going to multiply 1 times 60 and then add to that 45 hundredths times 60. And then I'll get my answer. So all I did was I took my fraction and decomposed it, and I'm just multiplying the separate pieces times 60. So I got 60 here because 1 times 60 is 60. And now I need to multiply 45 hundredths times 60. Well, we know that when I multiply fractions, I do numerator times numerator and denominator times denominator. I'm going to use my calculator to figure out what 45 times 60 is. And I get this. Now I'm going to simplify this by dividing by 100, and I get 60 plus 27. When I add that up, I get 87. So my answer is 87. You should have gotten 87 whether you multiplied the decimal times 60 or if you multiplied the fraction times 60, you should have gotten the same answer. I'm going to show the problems again, and this time I want you to try number 3. If I decompose what it's saying, it's asking me for 15% of is the keyword, and is what number is the keyword. Is what number tells me that it's equal to, of tells me to multiply, and then I need to turn 15% into a decimal or a fraction. I'm going to turn it into a percent, 15 hundredths. Sorry, not a percent, a decimal. All right, so now I need to multiply 0.15 times 60. You can use your calculator for this if you like. Once I add it together, I end up with 900. I need to figure out where my decimal goes. No digits to the right of the decimal here, 2 digits to the right of the decimal there. My answer should have 2 digits to the right of the decimal. So I'm going to put it between the 9 and the 0, and that way it has 2 digits to the right. So 15% of 60 is 9. That's my answer. My answer is 9. You should have gotten the same thing if you used a fraction version of the percentage. You should still get the same answer. 60% is 5% of what number? So my key terms here is of what number? So I know that is, I learned in the previous chapter that is synonymous with equals. So 60% is 5%. I need to write that as a decimal or a fraction. Of what number? Of usually means that I should multiply. Actually, I should put a dot. And the reason why I should put a dot is because what number, I don't know what that is. Since I don't know what that is, and I'm multiplying, I need to put a variable. I can put an X, I can put an A, I can put a C for Catrice, or a G for Griffin. All right, so basically I'm saying that when I take my percentage and multiply it by X, I get 60. If this is confusing, I can also rewrite it another way. I can rewrite it this way. X times 0.05, I'm just rearranging it, is equal to 60 if we're used to the equal sign being on the other side. So then I need to use inverse operations to solve for X. Right now I have multiplication here. So to undo multiplication, I need to divide. I'm going to divide both sides by 0.05. That will cause that one to go to be a 1, so I end up with just 1x. And now I'm dividing 60 by 0.05. I'm using my calculator, but I can show you the long way. 0.05 divided by 60. If I did long division to figure this out, I would need to turn this into a whole number by moving my decimal 2 places. So that means here I need to also move my decimal 2 places. And then I would divide 5 into 60. When I did that, I would get, 5 into 6, 1. And then subtract, bring that down. I get a 2 there.
It's going to be 120.
Zeros. Thank you. Well, 2 zeros. So 1,200. So once I get that X is equal to 1,200. Because my decimal is not in front of the 5, it's in front of the 0 in front of the 5. And so if you were putting this into your calculator, you would have to remember, if I was solving this using a fraction and putting it into my calculator, it would look a little bit like this. I would have 60 is equal to 5 over 100 times X. In order for me to undo this multiplying by a fraction, I need to multiply by the reciprocal, which means that I'm multiplying both sides by 100 over 5 there and 100 over 5 here. And so this would cancel and just leave me with X. And then in my calculator, I'm entering 100 divided by 5 times 60. And I get the same answer. I have 200% of what number is, and then 90. So 200% I can turn into a fraction or a decimal. If I turn it into a decimal, it would be 2.00. If I turn it into a fraction, it would be 200 over 100. I can simplify that and just make it a 2. I don't have to simplify it, but it's easy to see that 200 divided by 100 is 2. All right, of means that I need to multiply, right? So I'm going to put a dot there. I keep putting an X for multiplication, but it gets really confusing because I have a variable here. Of what number can be X, where any other variable is, gives me an equal sign, and then 90. So I'm writing it 3 different times because I have 3 different expressions here. I have 2x is equal to 90. 2 times x is equal to 90. I also have 200 hundredths times x is equal to 90. Forgot a 0. And then I have 2, again, times x is equal to 90 because I simplified this fraction to be just 2. And once I get that, I can start solving for x. I'm going to divide both sides by 2. When I do that, I get x is equal to 45. So 200% of 45 is 90. If I was solving this one with a fraction, I would need to multiply both sides by the reciprocal. Remember, the reciprocal is just a fraction flipped. So I would multiply this side times 100 over 200 and this side times 100 over 200. And when I did that, this side would cancel and I would get that x is equal to 45. I would get the exact same answer. All right, so my keywords, what percent of these? So what percent? I don't know what it is, so that would give me the X, right? Of 72. That means I need to multiply this times 72, and my answer is 36. So I had 72 times X, or X times 72 is equal to 36. I'm going to divide both sides by 72 to get my X by itself, also known as isolating the variable. When I do that, I get that X is equal to 36 divided by 72. For this, I'm going to use my calculator. My calculator gives me 0.5. This is not a percent. I need to write it as a percent. So I need to write 0.5 or 5/10 as a percent. That means I need to have a denominator of 100 times 10. I end up with 50 hundredths. So my answer is 50%. So my key terms are, come on, camera. Trying to let it focus. There we go. My key terms are what percent of and is. What percent? I don't know that. That's my X. Of tells me that I need to multiply. 120 stays in the place that it is. Is equal, and then 90. All right, so what do I have? I have X times 120 is equal to 90. I need to do inverse operations to solve for X, so I'm going to divide both sides by 120. When I do that, X is equal to 90 divided by 120. When I type that into my calculator, I get 0.75. This is not a percent. The question asks what percent, so that means I need to give my answer in the form of a percent. There's two ways I can think about turning this decimal into a percent. One way is to multiply by 100. The other way is to convert it to a fraction and then turn that fraction into a percentage. So this is 75 hundredths. When I do that, I end up with, oh, it's just 75 over 100. That means it's 75%.